I wanted to talk about this book today called Interpreting Subcultures, Approaching, Contextualizing, and Embodying Sense-Making Practices in Alternative Cultures, edited by J. Patrick Williams. This book fits into the subfield of sociology that focuses on subcultures. And in the first chapter called Making Sense of Subcultures, Interpretive Practices and in Subcultural Theory, the editor of the anthology, Williams, lays it out for us. And so first of all, it's contextualized theoretically and methodologically with the Chicago School that was the birthplace of this ethnographic sociology in the early 1900s. And so sociologists in Chicago wanted to really go out into the city as laboratory and explore marginalized communities such as ethnic communities and also deviant, criminal, and underground subcultures. And so the Chicago School really introduced us to this hands-on ethnographic methodological approach, especially within so-called deviant subcultures. And that word deviance is a sociological word that's continued to this day related to looking at subcultures leading into the field of criminology. And on the other hand, you have Birmingham School, or the Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies, CCCS, which was the UK equivalent that was also examining subcultures. And this was in the 1960s, so they were examining music and youth-related subcultures such as the Teddy Boys and rock and roll subcultures, gang cultures. So in this chapter, Williams is taking those two theoretical models of schools and providing an overview of those theoretical and methodological approaches, because all of the authors in this anthology do have a background using those kinds of framework. And those are the frameworks that are going to provide the subcultural key concepts that are used throughout the book. And overall, the book is examining how these approaches to subcultural studies and these types of key concepts apply to more contemporary and global subculturals in this current era. But the most important aspect that he's pointing out in this first chapter is that it's this interpretive approach to subcultures that this book is really going to contribute to the field. This book, the first level of analysis is on the interpretive processes, and that includes the processes as conducted by the researchers and within the academic framework and approach to those studies and how they get written up and published and interpreted by the scholarly community, but also the interpretive aspects that are at play in the subcultural field of research. So how the field itself talks about itself and its community, as well as how the participants make sense of their community, their identities, and the key concepts that arise within those communities organically. And if those academic concepts have any kind of relevancy within the field of these subcultural communities, and if so, how those communities interpret and process those aspects. So the first chapter is really just getting us within that kind of theoretical and methodological approach to understanding that we're going to be focusing on this first layer of interpretation. And so the second chapter and the chapters in this first part are all written by people that have studied their particular subculture for many decades. And often these are subcultures, obviously, that have been around for a few decades and that fit within those kinds of theoretical approaches to subcultures and these classical models, including, as the second chapter focuses on, the straight edge movement. In this chapter, Ross Handfler is an ethnographer who has been studying the straight edge community for decades. And so in this particular chapter, he's trying to see if the key terms such as subculture, scene, lifestyle, or movement apply to the straight edge community within itself and how it communicates about itself, including on online platforms. And so basically he uses the first part of the chapter to establish these particular key concepts and how they have been established within the academic literature over the previous decades. And then he takes those key concepts and applies them to some ethnographic data, such as participant interviews, where he either asks about those key concepts and terms or else just tries to get at those kinds of conceptualizations organically through the participants. And so for example, do straight edge community members think of themselves as a subculture? Does the straight edge community consider itself a scene? Is it a lifestyle, or is it a social movement? And so for each of these key terms, he interviews participants and basically presents an analysis of what the participants say about those particular types of concepts. So it just shows the application of what this book is going to be doing, of applying these kinds of subcultural key concepts to particular music subcultures. In the third chapter, for example, the authors Andy Bennett and Danielle Bennett, called Ghosts in the Machine, Post-Subculture and the Problem of Contemporary Youth. The author is a long-term subcultural ethnographer, and he's applying his concepts and approach to the youth subcultures that his son is participating in. And so through conversations with his son in this chapter, he's talking about the continued relevancy or non-relevancy of these ideas. Part 2 is called Contextualizing Interpretive Practices. In this section, the next 4 chapters, now these ideas are being applied to contemporary music subculture scenes in 4 different international countries, including Portugal and in Asia. The 4th chapter is called No More Heroes, Portuguese Punk and the Notion of Subculture in the Global South. This chapter starts, of course, with contextualizing the political background in Portugal, talking about a society that lived under 4 decades of repressive dictatorship, and therefore there was no abilities for freedom of speech, for musical subcultures to be critiquing the government. The author also talks a bit about positioning Portugal within this concept of the global south, using Wallerstein to talk about core and periphery positioning within the global culture and within the global power structure. And so overall, this punk scene in Portugal takes place after the end of this dictatorship, and it does borrow concepts and symbolic styles and imagery from the West and brings that into these subcultures. And one of the ways in which the West really kind of provides the framework of particularly a punk subculture is that a lot of the online platforms that the Portuguese punk scene was tuned into are all in English. So they first of all have to be in English, and therefore adopting those kinds of key concepts and imagery of what a punk subculture looks like. It provides its own cultural reference points that are relevant to that particular community and that particular history. So this article looking at Portugal really just demonstrates the interplay within this global punk scene and these kinds of iconic imagery that came out of the UK and the US, and then how different national contexts adopt those, but also how they reframe them and provide their own kind of cultural interpretation to these processes that make sense within their own particular context. Chapter 5 by author Shin is called Still Crazy After All Those Years, a trajectory of discourses on youth subcultures in Korea from exclusion to recognition to legitimacy. And so the author states in the opening paragraph that their aim is to challenge this binary thinking between subculture and activism, that this kind of cultural response to society through music and through style is also an aspect of activism. The author in this chapter takes these theoretical frameworks of subculture and sees if they apply to the Asian context, and already says that yes, these concepts are present in the academic discourse. However, they really don't have resonancy in the field, in the everyday life of subcultural participants. Instead, the author quotes this Korean term, which is the equivalent of the term subculture, and the author points out that this term says something more along the lines of lowbrow culture or low culture, literally meaning low-ranking culture. Despite the dark and inferior nuances that presuppose a conventional cultural hierarchy, it is still widely used in academic discourse in Korea. And obviously, as the word itself implies, this is a largely negative and derogatory term. The author states, based in Hongdae, a western part of metropolitan Seoul, the indie culture's artistic creativity, anti-commercialist attitude, and spontaneous characteristics went beyond all the reservations that had disqualified the new generation culture in the specific sense as a subculture. And so we see it's this very international part of a main metropolitan ultra-urban atmosphere that provides the international context of this subculture to develop. And actually, the author concludes by stating the practice of matching Western theories in Asian cases is becoming less relevant, that these terms do not have exact equivalents in English and are hard to understand without considering the specific cultural context. Yet discourses on Asian subcultures in the narrow sense have tended to rely too much on culturalism or cultural essentialism, so that there's this delicate balance between not essentializing a culture but understanding the contributions that that culture is going to make to any kind of oppositional or subcultural context that develops within that society. Chapter 6 is called Interpreting Chinese Punk, From Doing Nothing to Hermit Lifestyle. The author states the thesis of this chapter will look at how the concepts of authenticity and resistance are developed in different socio-cultural contexts and introduce a Chinese philosophical framework to give further interpretive power to local punk phenomenon. The chapter looks at fieldwork cases of Chinese punks. So the first author of this study has been researching Chinese punk since 2011 and states that while protests are forbidden in China, how to regard people's practices as being resistant becomes a crucial question and problem for interpretation. In China, with the Great Firewall on the internet and the repression of political protest and critique of the government, people have to be really sneaky in how they make any kind of criticism publicly, and also just the engagement in these kinds of musical subcultures and any kind of subcultural activity. You know, anything that's performed on stage just has a high risk for repression, and so the resistance is going to be mostly covert. So the author talks about how particular cultural Chinese context and even ideas going back to Confucius are embedded within any resistance interpretation. The author states, notably, doing nothing is invested as a practice of resistance to the mainstream for some of the Chinese punk musicians. And we've seen in the media too that this doing nothing, or as it's called, lying flat resistance in China, has been talked about in news stories, because this is one way in which young people can resist this kinds of grueling social pressure they face for constant work and also this materialism culture. And so the author says it was Confucius who first explicitly put forward the term rule by doing nothing. And a related subculture is what the author calls Chinese hermits, have lately emerged as a phenomenon in China, referring to those educated people who hide and live in suburbs because they are not interested in or are tired of politics. And they talked about one example that sheds light on the social context that only the government can own property, and so Chinese citizens have long-term leases but ultimately never truly own the land that they're on. And so the authors were talking about these kinds of squatter subcultures, and they're not actual squatters because they are living out in rural areas and paying rent on derelict properties where many young people come together to live together and to participate in just hanging out and making music. And so, for example, the author states that a Chinese hermit lifestyle includes symbols and practices such as living away from populated urban areas, drinking alcohol regularly, and wearing untidy clothing. Clothes were an important sign of rank and status in ancient Chinese society. So this idyllic lifestyle of enjoying nature and resisting this urban, commercial, career-focused pressure to earn lots of money, to work really hard, to buy property, to get married. And so this author also concludes by stating that indeed applying concepts based on Western subculture practices in a different context requires modification. But more importantly, this process becomes a moment for critical reflection on both concepts and interpretation. And chapter 7 also focuses on musical resistance subcultures in Indonesia, and Indonesia also has this similar background to the other chapters that were covered, with a dictatorship and a very repressive regime in which any kind of political engagement or activism is repressed. And this chapter also has similar conclusions by stating that this particular national identity in Asian context is more important and overrides these outside Western concepts of subculture. Part 3 is called Embodying Interpretive Practice. This part has 3 different chapters, and they're all focused on embodiment and the significance within that particular subculture. And so the first layer of embodiment is between researcher and participant, and so all of these researchers use their embodied subcultural status as insiders to gain access to that community and bond with their participants to build trust and rapport in order to demonstrate that they're all part of the same subculture. And then all 3 of the chapters are also talking about the significance of embodiment within the subcultural scene itself, how people feel pressured to present themselves. The first article of this section, chapter 8, by Laura Way, is called That's Not Punk: Authenticity, Older Punk Women, and the Doing of Punk Scholarship. And so these participants felt that, they were probably engaged in the punk subculture when they were young. Now they're older, and so they've probably distanced themselves from presenting themselves in the punk subcultural kind of way. They've probably had children and become fully employed, but they're still involved in their subcultural music scene to some extent. But when they go to shows, they feel like an outcast or like someone who doesn't belong because they might not fit this stereotype of how one is supposed to present themselves in that subculture. And of course, they're older as well, and these subcultures are often associated with youth, although, they're all growing older as well. So the participants and the hanger-oners in those scenes are also aging. That was the large narrative within these participants, is just their insecurities about whether they would be perceived as a subcultural member within the punk subculture. The author additionally is, of course, talking about how important it was for her to also be a subcultural member and to relate to the participants on this level. And so therefore the embodiment practice within the subculture was very important within the scene, within the community, between participants, and then between the participant and the researcher. Chapter 9 was called Let's All Be Friends: Emotional Labor and Inside Research in Punk Subculture. And these 2 authors of this chapter were involved in anarcho-punk scenes in the 1980s through the 2000s. One of them was a band member and just very actively engaged in the scene, and they thought that this history of theirs in the scene would provide authenticity and help them access the scene and contact potential participants. But actually this backfired because they did face unexpected distrust with the scene, and participants really trying to figure out, their credentials for being in the scene. One of the authors was focused on doing research examining sexism within the anarcho-punk scene, and the other was looking at fascism and political engagement. And so through these processes of examining this kind of political contentious aspects to the subculture, they were really disappointed to see that actually this anarcho-punk scene was more performative in their political engagement and weren't really making progress in making the world or the scene a better place along those lines of anti-sexism and anti-fascism. And so both of the authors end up dropping out of the scene with a bad taste in their mouth. So actually they're talking about just the flip side, the bad side of being an insider within a particular subculture and community is that you can learn things about your subculture you'd rather not know or dig that deeply into, and it can actually lead you to leaving the scene. Chapter 10 is called Intimacy, Exchange, and Friendship as Sensitizing Concept: Interpreting and Teaching Subcultures Through Ethnographic Fieldwork. This chapter presents these ethnographic vignettes of the researchers gaining access and interacting with participants in the field. And so there are several different types of context, different types of research, and just the ways in which the exchange between researcher and participant played out, and how it relates to these sensitizing concepts of intimacy, exchange, and friendship. And so those concepts then become central to how research in this case is engaged and the actual interaction and what that looks like. And then this is also being talked about within the context of how to teach students about methodological approaches to particular scenes. The final part 4 is called The Conclusion. It has the concluding chapter. And so in this chapter 11, Approaching, Contextualizing, and Embodying Interpretive Practices in Subcultural Studies, the editor of the volume, Williams and Samuel Judah, talk about applying now these concepts that they've been applied to these ethnographic works throughout this book, and applying it to now going beyond this book and looking at a sample of academic journal articles within the field of subcultural studies and how they approach these key concepts and how they might differ from these ethnographic research articles that we overviewed in this book. And so unlike the participants in this book who had ethnographic methodology, a lot of the articles that they examined were not based on ethnography, or even researchers never even communicated with people in those particular subcultures because, for example, they might have been doing a content analysis of forums on Reddit or Discord or stuff like that. So they just see how the community members engage and speak to each other on an online platform. There was overall kind of a more negative approach to these particular groups that researchers were looking at from a distance. They would label them, for example, using key terms such as deviance or criminality. And so overall, the conclusion is again just talking about focus on interpretation within these studies. And so going beyond now the interpretive process that was engaged in with these ethnographic researchers in this anthology, and looking at outside academic research and how that continues to interpret subcultures and these kinds of subcultural key concepts and the embodied stylistic self-presentations within the scenes, within the subcultures, and how that filters up to the academic interpretation of subcultures and how that literature ends up being presented to the scholarly community that examines subcultures. So this book, Interpreting Subcultures, just fits within this long series of books on subcultures, on this subfield of sociology that examines subculture. Of course, my research looking at tattooed women was definitely pulled a lot on subcultural research, and so it's really great to see this new work coming. And it was really interesting, especially to see the Asian context and to read about Chinese and Korean and Indonesian punk scenes. So I would really definitely personally love to learn a lot more about that and explore those kinds of scenes in my travels. So definitely would love to hear from anyone out there who's researching subculture and or participating in ethnographic research. Like, what kind of challenges are there for folks to get inside of these subcultures that might be marginalized or closed off in some ways? So thank you for watching, and I look forward to your comments.